The boy knocked on Henry Whitaker's door 3 times. The first knock was so quiet that Henry almost ignored it. The second made him stop halfway up the stairs. The third made him turn around. It was nearly midnight on December 18, 1988, and snow had covered the road outside his farmhouse. Henry opened the door. A 12-year-old boy stood on the porch. His coat was soaked. His shoes were covered in mud and snow. One sleeve was torn. He was shivering so badly that his teeth were clicking together. Henry stared at him. "Where are your parents?" The boy looked down. "I don't know." Henry frowned. "What's your name?" "Daniel." "Daniel what?" "Carter." Henry looked down the empty road. "No one else with you?" Daniel shook his head. Henry noticed something then. The boy wasn't crying. He looked as though he had already cried until there was nothing left. Henry stepped aside. "Come in." Daniel didn't move. Henry looked at him again. "I said come in." The boy swallowed. "Do I have to pay?" Henry's expression changed. "No." "Work?" "No." "Then why are you letting me in?" Henry looked at the child standing alone in the freezing night. "Because you're cold." That was all. No questions about money. No promises. No conditions. Just 2 words that would change both their lives. "Come in." Henry Whitaker had lived alone for 3 years. His wife, Margaret, had died in the spring of 1985. Since then, the farmhouse had become quieter with every passing season. Her blue coffee mug still sat above the kitchen sink. Her recipe box remained beside the stove. Sometimes Henry still caught himself setting 2 plates on the table before remembering there was only one person left to feed. That night he had been preparing a simple dinner when Daniel appeared. Henry placed a bowl of hot soup in front of him. Daniel stared at it. "Go ahead." The boy picked up the spoon. He ate quickly. Too quickly. Henry quietly pushed the breadbasket toward him. Daniel stopped. "You can have that too." The boy looked up. "Are you sure?" Henry nodded. Daniel took a piece. After several minutes, the bowl was empty. Henry poured him milk. Then he noticed Daniel watching the kitchen door. "What are you looking for?" "Nothing." "You expecting someone?" Daniel shook his head. Henry didn't press. Instead, he said, "You can sleep in the spare room." Daniel looked surprised. "Tonight?" Henry nodded. "Tonight." Daniel hesitated. "And tomorrow?" Henry looked toward the window. Snow was falling harder. "Tomorrow can wait until morning." For the first time, Daniel looked less frightened. The spare bedroom had once belonged to Henry's son. The boy had left home years ago and rarely wrote. Henry gave Daniel an old flannel shirt and an extra blanket. At the door, Daniel asked, "Can I keep my shoes with me?" Henry looked at him. "Why?" "So nobody takes them." Henry understood. "Keep them." Daniel placed the shoes beside the bed. He slept with one hand resting on them. Henry noticed the next morning. He said nothing. Daniel stayed one night, then another. By Christmas, Henry had stopped asking when he would leave. The county had been contacted. Daniel had no stable family willing to take him. A temporary arrangement was being discussed, but the paperwork moved slowly. So Daniel remained. And somewhere between Christmas and New Year's Day, something unexpected happened. The farmhouse stopped feeling empty. Daniel helped Henry carry firewood. Henry taught Daniel how to repair a broken fence. Daniel learned to fix the loose cabinet door in the kitchen. Henry showed him how to sharpen a pencil with a pocket knife without cutting his thumb. Daniel failed twice. Henry laughed. Daniel laughed too. It was a small moment, but Henry remembered it, because it was the first time he had seen the boy laugh without looking over his shoulder afterward. One afternoon, Henry found Daniel in the workshop, staring at an old wooden chair. "That belonged to Margaret," Henry said. Daniel immediately stepped back. "Sorry. You didn't break it." "I thought maybe I could fix it." Henry looked at the chair. One leg was loose. The armrest had cracked. Henry handed Daniel a piece of sandpaper. "Then fix it." Daniel looked surprised. "Really? I'm not going to do it for you." For the next 2 hours, Daniel worked. His hands were small. His movements were slow. But he didn't quit. When the chair finally stood straight, Daniel looked at Henry. "Is it okay?" Henry sat down. The chair creaked, then held. Henry nodded. "Better than okay." Daniel smiled. Henry looked at the repaired chair, then at the boy. He didn't know it yet, but that chair would remain in the farmhouse for the next 20 years, and one day Daniel would sit in it again. Winter passed quickly. Daniel became part of Henry's routine. Every morning, Henry made coffee. Every morning, Daniel drank milk. On Saturdays, they repaired things in the workshop. On Sundays, they listened to the radio while snow covered the fields. One evening, Daniel asked, "Did you love your wife?" Henry looked toward Margaret's photograph. "Yes." "A lot?" Henry smiled. "More than I knew how to explain." Daniel was quiet. Then he asked, "Does it stop hurting?" Henry thought for a moment. "No." Daniel looked disappointed. Henry continued, "You just learn how to carry it." Daniel looked down at the table. "I think I know what that means." Henry didn't ask what he meant. He simply reached across the table and squeezed the boy's shoulder. Then, in March, the county worker came. She stood in the kitchen with a folder in her hands. "We found a temporary foster placement for Daniel." Henry nodded. He had known this day would come. Daniel was standing in the hallway. He heard every word. That night, Henry found him packing. "You don't have to do that yet." "I know." Daniel folded the flannel shirt. Henry watched. "You'll be going to a good family." "You don't know that?" "No." Henry sat on the edge of the bed. "But I know you're going to be okay." Daniel shook his head. "What if they don't want me?" Henry looked directly at him. "Then you remember what I told you." "What?" "You don't decide your worth by whether someone else knows how to see it." Daniel stared at him. Then Henry reached into his pocket. He placed a small wooden object in Daniel's palm. It was a handmade compass. Daniel turned it over. "You made this?" "Last night." "Why?" Henry smiled. "Because you're going somewhere I've never been." Daniel looked at the compass. "What if I get lost?" "Then use it." "What if it doesn't work?" Henry pointed toward Daniel's chest. "The compass isn't the important part." Daniel looked confused. "What's important?" "Remembering where you came from." Daniel closed his fingers around it. The foster car arrived the next morning. Daniel stood at the bottom of the porch steps with a small bag in his hand. Henry stood beside him. The wind was cold. Daniel looked toward the farmhouse, then back at Henry. "Will you still be here?" Henry knew what he was really asking. "Will I forget you? Will you forget me? Will this place still exist when I need somewhere to return to?" Henry nodded. "I'll be here." Daniel's eyes filled. "Promise?" Henry put a hand on his shoulder. "I promise." Daniel hugged him. It lasted only a few seconds, but Henry held on longer. Then Daniel climbed into the car. The vehicle began moving down the snowy road. Daniel looked through the rear window. Henry remained on the porch. He raised one hand. Daniel raised his. The distance between them grew, and then the farmhouse disappeared behind the trees. Henry stood there long after the car was gone. He didn't know that the boy would remember that porch for the rest of his life. He didn't know that the compass would remain in Daniel's possession for 20 years. And he certainly didn't know that the next time Daniel stood outside that door, he wouldn't be 12 anymore. 20 years later, Henry Whitaker was 88. The farmhouse was falling apart. The porch needed repairs. The barn roof leaked. The fields were still beautiful, but Henry could no longer work them the way he once had, and the medical bills had become impossible to manage. Then one morning, a brown envelope arrived. Henry opened it at the kitchen table. He read the first page, then the second. His hand began to tremble. It was a foreclosure notice. 30 days. That was all the time he had. 30 days before the farmhouse he had spent his entire life protecting would belong to someone else. Henry folded the letter. He looked toward Margaret's photograph, then toward the empty chair, and finally toward the hallway where a 12-year-old boy had once stood holding a wooden compass. Henry whispered, "I promised I'd still be here." Outside, an engine suddenly growled. Henry looked through the window. A black sedan had stopped at the end of the driveway. The driver's door opened. A tall man in a dark coat stepped out. He stood beside the car for a moment, looking at the farmhouse. Then he reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around something small and wooden. The man began walking toward the porch. Henry watched him approach. He had no idea who the stranger was, but the stranger knew exactly who Henry was. And before he knocked on the door, he looked down at the old wooden compass in his hand. Then he whispered, "I'm home." 20 years had passed since Daniel Carter had looked through the rear window of a county car and watched Henry Whitaker disappear behind the trees. But Daniel had never forgotten the porch or the promise. "I'll be here." Those 3 words followed him through every place he lived, through 3 different foster homes, through high school, through his first job, through the years when he had barely enough money for dinner, and eventually through the years when he had more money than he knew what to do with. Daniel was 40 now. He owned a successful construction company in Pennsylvania. He had a house of his own, a comfortable office, employees who depended on him, people who knew his name. But there was one thing he had never been able to buy: the feeling of being 12 years old again, standing on Henry's porch, knowing someone wanted him there. He still had the compass. It had traveled with him for 20 years. The wood was scratched. The needle no longer pointed perfectly north. But Daniel kept it in the top drawer of his desk. Whenever life became too loud, he opened that drawer. He would hold the compass in his palm and remember a sentence Henry had told him. "Remember where you came from." For years, Daniel had wanted to go back, but wanting to return and knowing how to return were 2 different things. The foster system had moved him from one county to another. Records changed, addresses disappeared, people moved. Eventually, Daniel stopped looking. Not because he had forgotten Henry, because he was afraid the farmhouse might no longer exist. Then, 2 months before his 40th birthday, Daniel found an old county record. It contained one name: Henry Whitaker, and one address. Daniel stared at the paper for several minutes. Then he called his assistant. "I need you to find out if this address is still active." His assistant asked why. Daniel simply replied, "Because I think I owe someone a visit." The answer came 3 days later. Henry was alive, 88 years old, living at the same farmhouse. Daniel sat alone in his office after hearing the news. He expected relief. Instead, he felt 12 again. He looked at the compass in his hand. Then he searched for the farmhouse on an old map. The address was real, but there was another piece of information. The property was under foreclosure proceedings. Daniel read the notice twice. Henry was about to lose the house. The house, the porch, the workshop, the kitchen where he had first been fed, the room where he had slept without worrying about tomorrow, the place that had given a homeless boy his first real sense of belonging. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He remembered something Henry had told him 20 years earlier. "You don't decide your worth by whether someone else knows how to see it." Daniel smiled sadly. "Then let me see yours." Henry's life had become much smaller. He woke before sunrise, made 1 cup of coffee, fed the chickens, checked the mailbox, then sat near the kitchen window. He could no longer work the fields. His knees hurt. His hands shook. The farmhouse needed repairs he could no longer afford, but he refused to leave. When the bank notice arrived, Henry placed it inside a drawer. He didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. His son had never returned. Margaret was gone, and Daniel had disappeared 20 years earlier. Henry sometimes wondered whether Daniel remembered him at all. Maybe he had grown up. Maybe he had a family. Maybe he had forgotten the old man who gave him one winter. Henry didn't blame him. Children were supposed to move forward, not spend their lives looking backward. Still, every December, Henry left the porch light on. He never admitted why. 3 days before Daniel's arrival, Henry walked into the workshop. Dust covered the workbench. The tools were exactly where he had left them. On the wall hung the repaired wooden chair, the same chair Daniel had fixed in 1989. Henry ran his fingers across the armrest. A tiny mark was still visible where Daniel's knife had slipped. Henry smiled. "You always rush the last part." His voice disappeared into the empty room. Then he heard something fall. A small wooden box slid from the shelf. Henry picked it up. Inside was an old photograph. He and Margaret stood beneath the oak tree. Daniel was between them, 12 years old, thin, shy, smiling. Henry sat on the workshop floor. He stared at the photograph, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to wonder, what if Daniel really did come back? Then he laughed quietly at himself. Don't be foolish. He put the photograph away, but he left the box on the workbench. The following Friday, Daniel drove to Mill Creek. He left before sunrise. He didn't take his assistant. He didn't take his company car. He drove an old pickup instead. He wanted the journey to feel ordinary, but nothing about it was ordinary. Every mile brought back something. The small grocery store where Henry used to buy bread, the church beside the road, the wooden bridge, the old gas station, then finally, Mill Creek Road. Daniel slowed down. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. The road looked narrower than he remembered. The trees looked taller. And then he saw it, the farmhouse. Daniel pulled the truck onto the shoulder. For several seconds, he couldn't move. The house was smaller. The white paint had faded. The porch sagged slightly, but it was still there, exactly where Henry had promised it would be. Daniel stepped out. He took the compass from his pocket. Then he crossed the road. Before reaching the porch, he stopped. He looked through the kitchen window. Henry was sitting at the table. Older. Much older. Daniel's throat tightened. For 20 years, he had imagined this man as he remembered him. Strong hands, straight shoulders, gray hair. Now those shoulders were bent. Those hands trembled as he lifted his coffee cup. Daniel suddenly wondered whether he had waited too long. He climbed the porch steps. 1, 2, 3. He raised his hand, then stopped. He remembered being 12, cold, hungry, terrified. 3 knocks. Daniel knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. Inside, Henry slowly stood. He walked toward the door. Daniel heard the lock turn. The door opened. Henry looked at him. Daniel looked back. Neither man spoke. Henry frowned slightly. "Can I help you?" Daniel tried to answer. Nothing came out. Henry looked at the stranger standing before him. Then Daniel reached into his pocket. He placed the old wooden compass in his palm. Henry's eyes dropped to it. His face changed. Daniel finally spoke. "Do you remember telling a boy you'd leave the porch light on?" Henry stared at the compass. His breathing became unsteady. "No." Daniel swallowed. His name was Daniel. Henry looked at him again. This time he didn't look at the man's face. He looked at the eyes, then the small scar near his eyebrow. A scar Daniel had gotten falling from the barn roof when he was 13. Henry's lips parted. "Daniel?" Daniel nodded. Henry stepped backward. His hand went to his chest. For a moment, Daniel thought he might fall. He caught him. "Easy." Henry stared at him. "You came back." Daniel smiled through tears. "I told you I would." Henry touched his face with a trembling hand. You were a boy. I know. You're... He laughed through his tears. You're an old man. Daniel laughed. Not quite. Henry pulled him into an embrace. Daniel closed his eyes. 20 years disappeared. The porch was the same. The house was the same. But the boy who had once needed Henry's help was gone. And the man standing there had come back for a reason. They sat together in the kitchen. Henry kept looking at Daniel as if he were afraid he might disappear. Daniel told him about his life, not everything, just enough. He told him about school, his first job, the construction company, the apartment he had once shared with 2 other men, the first house he bought, the first employee he hired. Henry listened with quiet pride. You did all that yourself? Daniel smiled. Not entirely. Henry understood. You remembered. Every day. Henry looked toward the window. I wondered if you hated me. Daniel's expression changed. Hated you? For letting you leave. Daniel shook his head. You didn't let me leave. Henry looked at him. You pushed me toward a life. I was afraid you would forget. I tried. Henry's eyes filled with tears. But I couldn't. Daniel reached across the table. He placed his hand over Henry's. Neither could I. For a while, they sat silently. Then Henry's eyes moved toward the drawer. Daniel noticed. What? Henry hesitated. Nothing. Daniel smiled. You were never good at hiding things. Henry laughed softly. No, I wasn't. He opened the drawer. Inside was the foreclosure notice. Daniel read it. His smile disappeared. How long? Henry looked down. 27 days. Why didn't you tell me? Because you just came home. This is your home. Henry nodded. I know. Then we're going to keep it. Henry immediately shook his head. No. Daniel looked at him. Why? Because I didn't take you in so you could spend your life paying me back. Daniel's eyes filled. I know. He folded the notice. That's not why I'm doing it. Henry looked confused. Daniel stood. He walked toward the kitchen window. Outside, the old porch light was still there, the same light Henry had promised to leave on. Daniel turned back. You gave me a place when I had nowhere to go. Henry lowered his eyes. It was one winter. Daniel shook his head. No. He looked directly at him. It was the beginning. Henry didn't answer. Daniel quietly added, Let me give something back. Henry looked at him. But before he could respond, a loud knock came from the front door. Both men turned. Henry's face changed. He knew who it was. The bank. Daniel looked at the clock. The foreclosure officer wasn't supposed to come until Monday. Another knock sounded. Harder this time. Daniel stood. I'll get it. Henry grabbed his arm. No. Why? Henry looked frightened. Because if they see you here... Daniel waited. Henry finally whispered. They'll know I have someone willing to help me. Daniel frowned. And that's bad? Henry's eyes filled with tears. You don't understand what this house means. Daniel looked around the kitchen, then at the old photograph. I think I understand better than anyone. The knocking came again. Daniel walked toward the door. This time he didn't hesitate. He opened it, and the man standing outside handed him a folder. Inside was the final foreclosure schedule. But there was something else. A sale date. Only 14 days away. Daniel looked at the paper, then at Henry. And something inside him became certain. 20 years ago, Henry had opened a door for a frightened boy without asking what that boy could give him. Now, it was Daniel's turn. And he wasn't going to let the door close. 14 days. That was all Henry had left. The bank representative placed the foreclosure papers on the kitchen table and left without saying much. Daniel watched the car disappear down the road. Then he looked at Henry. Why didn't you tell me? Henry folded the papers. Because you came back after 20 years. That doesn't answer my question. Henry sighed. I didn't want the first thing you saw when you came home to be my problems. Daniel stared at him. You think I'm here because I feel sorry for you? No. Then what do you think I'm here for? Henry looked toward the old photograph on the shelf. I don't know anymore. Daniel walked to the window. Outside, the farmhouse looked tired. The porch needed new boards. The barn roof had several missing shingles. The paint was peeling around the windows. But Daniel didn't see a dying property. He saw the place where his life had changed. He saw the porch where Henry had found him. The kitchen where he had eaten his first full meal. The workshop where he had learned how to repair things instead of throwing them away. And suddenly, he remembered something else. His first night there. He had asked Henry, "Why are you letting me stay?" Henry had answered, "Because you're cold." Daniel turned around. How much? Henry frowned. What? How much do you owe? Henry shook his head. No. Henry, I said no. Daniel sat across from him. Then tell me the truth. Henry looked at the papers. Medical bills? Daniel waited. After Margaret died, I managed. Henry's voice became quieter. But the last 2 years were different. He explained that repairs had piled up. The tractor had broken. The roof had leaked. His property taxes had increased. Then came the hospital bills. He had used nearly all his savings. Finally, the bank loan had fallen behind. Daniel listened without interrupting. When Henry finished, Daniel asked, "How much to save the house?" Henry gave him the figure. Daniel was silent. It was significant, but not enough to change his life. Henry looked at him. Don't. Daniel smiled faintly. I haven't said anything. You're thinking about paying it. Yes. You can't. Why? Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life knowing you bought this house because of me. Daniel leaned forward. You're still misunderstanding. Henry looked at him. This isn't about buying a house. Daniel tapped the foreclosure notice. This is about keeping a promise. Henry's eyes filled. You were 12. I remember exactly how old I was. Daniel stood. And I remember exactly what you gave me. The next morning, Daniel drove into town. He met with the bank manager. He asked for the complete account history. Then he asked about the property. The manager recognized his company name. You're Daniel Carter? Daniel nodded. You own Carter Construction? Yes. The manager looked surprised. You know Mr. Whitaker personally? Daniel smiled. Very personally. The manager studied the file. If you're considering purchasing the property, we can arrange... I'm not purchasing it. The manager stopped. Then what are you doing? Daniel looked at the foreclosure documents. I'm paying what he owes. The manager hesitated. You understand this is a substantial amount. I do. And you don't want ownership? No. Then why? Daniel thought about Henry's kitchen. The old chair, the compass, the porch light. Because 20 years ago, an old man gave a 12-year-old boy a place to sleep without asking what he could give in return. The manager didn't answer. Daniel continued. I'm not interested in owning his house. He closed the folder. I just want him to keep it. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the farmhouse. Henry was outside repairing a section of fence. Daniel took the hammer from his hand. I've got it. Henry frowned. Just the things that shouldn't have been allowed to break. Henry watched him work. For the next several hours, they repaired the fence together. Daniel could have hired 10 men to finish it in an afternoon. Instead, he stayed beside Henry because he realized something. Henry didn't need a millionaire. He needed the boy he remembered, the boy who used to stand beside him in the workshop, the boy who had once asked, "Can I try?" So Daniel handed him the hammer whenever he could. and Henry corrected his mistakes exactly as he had 20 years earlier. "You're holding it wrong." Daniel laughed. "Some things never change." Henry smiled. "No." That evening, Daniel found the old wooden chair in the workshop, the same chair he had repaired as a child. He sat down. It creaked. Henry stood in the doorway. "You fixed that." Daniel ran his hand along the armrest. "I remember. You were convinced you could do it better than me." "I probably could have." Henry laughed. "You were 12. "I was talented." Henry shook his head. For a few seconds, they simply smiled. Then Daniel noticed something hanging above the workbench. A photograph. It showed Henry and Margaret beneath the oak tree. Daniel walked closer. "You still have it?" Henry nodded. "Of course." Daniel looked at Margaret. "I never met her properly." Henry's smile faded. "She would have liked you." "How do you know?" "Because she always had a weakness for people who needed a second chance." Daniel looked at him. "Was that why you helped me?" Henry didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Partly." Daniel waited. Henry touched the photograph. "Mostly because I knew what it felt like to need someone." Daniel lowered his eyes. That sentence stayed with him. 2 days later, Daniel received a call from the bank. The foreclosure had been temporarily suspended. Henry didn't know. Daniel wanted to tell him, but he decided to wait. He had one more thing to do. He drove to the farmhouse early the next morning. Henry was still asleep. Daniel walked through the quiet house. He stopped at the kitchen. Everything looked exactly as it had 20 years ago. The blue mug, the wooden table, the old clock. He opened a drawer. Inside was the compass's original box. Daniel stared at it. Then he noticed something underneath, a folded piece of paper. He pulled it out. It was his own handwriting. He remembered writing it when he was 12. The words were simple. "Mr. Whitaker, I don't know when I'll be able to come back. But if I ever become someone you can be proud of, I will." Daniel stared at the paper. He had completely forgotten about it. At the bottom was one final sentence. "I won't forget the winter." Daniel closed his eyes. He suddenly heard footsteps behind him. Henry. "What are you doing?" Daniel turned. He held up the paper. Henry recognized it immediately. "You kept that?" Henry nodded. "I found it under your mattress after you left." Daniel smiled sadly. "You should have thrown it away." "I couldn't." "Why?" Henry looked at the handwriting. "Because I wanted to know what happened to you." Daniel folded the paper carefully. "I came back." Henry nodded. "I see that." Daniel looked at him. "No." He held up the foreclosure papers. "You haven't seen anything yet." Henry's expression changed. "What did you do?" Daniel smiled. "I handled it." Henry immediately understood. "No." "Henry, you paid the bank." "Yes." Henry's voice became angry. "I told you not to." "I know." "You had no right." "I had every right." "No." Henry's eyes filled with tears. "You were a child who came to my door because you had nowhere else to go. I didn't help you so that 20 years later you could come back and throw money at me." Daniel stood silently. Then he said, "You didn't give me money." Henry stopped. "You gave me a winter." Daniel's voice cracked. "You gave me food when I was hungry. You gave me a bed when I was scared. You taught me how to fix things. You taught me that being unwanted didn't mean being worthless." Henry looked away. Daniel continued. "I spent 20 years trying to become the man you thought I could be." Henry's eyes filled. "And now you're telling me I can't do one thing for you?" Henry couldn't answer. Daniel stepped closer. "This isn't charity." He placed the old compass on the table. "This is my way of coming home." Henry looked at it. His face crumpled. He turned away so Daniel wouldn't see him cry. But Daniel saw, and for the first time, Henry understood something. The boy he had once saved didn't come back because he was successful. He came back because he remembered. That evening, Henry asked Daniel to sit with him on the porch. The sun was disappearing behind the fields. The air had turned cold. Henry looked at the porch light. "You remember what I promised you?" Daniel nodded. "I'd leave the light on." Henry smiled. "I never turned it off." Daniel looked at him. "Why?" Henry was quiet. "Because I thought maybe one day you'd come back." Daniel looked down. "You waited 20 years?" Henry shrugged. "Not every day." Daniel smiled. "How often?" Henry looked toward the road. "Every winter." Daniel couldn't speak. Then Henry reached into his coat. He pulled out a small envelope. Daniel recognized the handwriting. His own. But there was something inside that he had never seen before. Henry handed it to him. "I found this years ago." Daniel opened it. Inside was a photograph. It showed Daniel at 12, standing beside Henry. Both were smiling. On the back, Henry had written, "The winter I learned that family doesn't always arrive by blood." Daniel's eyes filled. Henry looked at him. "You were never a debt, Daniel." Daniel looked up. "You were family." For a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. Then he leaned forward and hugged the old man. Henry held him tightly. Neither spoke. The porch light remained above them, warm, steady, just as it had been 20 years earlier. But neither man noticed the small envelope lying on the porch table. It had arrived that afternoon. Daniel picked it up. There was no bank logo, no return address, only one sentence written across the front. "Henry Whitaker, final notice." Daniel opened it. His expression changed. The bank wasn't the only problem. The property had been sold at auction that morning. Someone else now legally owned the land. And according to the papers, Henry had only 7 days to leave. Henry read the final page again. Then he looked at Daniel. 7 days? Daniel nodded. Henry's hands began to tremble. "But you said you handled the bank." "I did." "Then how can they sell the property?" Daniel took the papers from him. "Because the mortgage was already transferred before I paid it. The bank no longer owned the debt." Henry stared at him. "So it's gone?" Daniel nodded. "The foreclosure sale happened this morning." Henry slowly sat down. For the first time since Daniel had returned, he looked defeated. "I knew this would happen." Daniel sat beside him. "What?" Henry stared at the farmhouse. "That one day I'd have to leave." Daniel looked at him. "No." Henry shook his head. "Daniel, I'm 88. I know. I can't fight banks. I can't rebuild this place. I can't start over." "You're not starting over." Henry looked at him. "You're going home?" Henry gave a tired smile. "This is my home." Daniel stood. "Then that's exactly what we're going to protect." The next morning, Daniel drove into town. He found the company that had purchased the property at auction. They were developers. They had bought several old properties around Mill Creek and planned to divide the land. Daniel made them an offer. They refused. Daniel made another. They still refused. Finally, Daniel placed a folder on the table. Inside was a certified check. The amount was far higher than what they had paid. The man across the desk stared at it. "You really want this farmhouse?" Daniel shook his head. "No." "Then why are you offering this much?" Daniel thought about the old porch. "The house isn't mine." The man frowned. "Then whose is it?" Daniel looked out the window. "An old man's." 2 days later, Daniel returned to the farmhouse. Henry was packing. There were only 3 boxes. Daniel stood in the doorway. "What are you doing?" Henry didn't turn around. "Getting ready." "You have 6 days." "I know." "Where are you going?" Henry stopped. I don't know. Daniel walked toward him. Then stop packing. Henry looked at him. I can't stay. Yes, you can. No, Daniel. Henry's voice cracked. You can't buy everything. Daniel smiled. I know. He reached into his coat, then placed a set of keys on the table. Henry stared at them. What are those? Your house keys. Henry looked confused. Daniel placed another document beside them. Read it. Henry unfolded the papers. His eyes moved slowly across the page, then stopped. He looked at Daniel. I don't understand. You own the farmhouse. Henry stared at him. No. Yes. You bought it? Daniel nodded. Henry's eyes filled. You said you weren't buying it. I didn't buy it for me. Henry looked back at the papers. The property had been transferred back into his name. No mortgage, no foreclosure, no debt. Henry shook his head. Daniel, I told you. Daniel's voice softened. This isn't charity. Henry couldn't speak. Daniel continued. The people who bought it didn't know what this place meant. To them, it was land. He looked around the kitchen. To me, it was the first place I ever felt safe. Henry wiped his eyes. You shouldn't have spent that much. Daniel smiled. You once gave a hungry 12-year-old your last bowl of soup. Henry looked at him. I had enough. So did I. Silence filled the kitchen. Then Henry walked toward Daniel. He put both hands on his shoulders. You really came back. Daniel smiled through tears. I told you I would. Henry pulled him into an embrace. This time, neither man let go quickly. The following morning, Daniel began repairing the farmhouse. Not because Henry couldn't afford repairs anymore, because they wanted to do it together. The porch boards were replaced. The kitchen windows were fixed. The barn roof was repaired. The old workshop was cleaned. Daniel brought in new tools. Henry complained that they were too expensive. Daniel ignored him. One afternoon, Henry found Daniel repairing the old wooden chair, the same chair Daniel had fixed when he was 12. Henry stood in the doorway. You're doing it wrong. Daniel looked up. I learned from you. That's your excuse? Daniel laughed. Henry walked over. He took the sandpaper from Daniel. Here. He showed him the correct way. Daniel smiled. Some things really don't change. Henry looked at him. No. Then he paused. But some things do. Daniel knew what he meant. 20 years ago, Henry had been the strong one. Now his hands shook. His steps were slower. His voice was softer. But the bond between them had somehow become stronger. Spring arrived. The snow disappeared from the fields. New grass grew around the farmhouse. One warm afternoon, Daniel and Henry walked to the oak tree behind the house. It was the same tree from the photograph. Henry sat beneath it. Daniel stood beside him. Do you remember the first time you saw this tree? Henry asked. Daniel smiled. I thought it was huge. It was. I tried climbing it. You fell. I know. You cried. I did not. Henry laughed. You absolutely did. Daniel sat beside him. For several minutes, they watched the wind move through the branches. Then Henry asked, Did you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't knocked on my door? Daniel looked at him. All the time. And? Daniel thought about it. I wouldn't have become the man I am. Henry shook his head. You did that? Daniel smiled. You showed me where to start. Henry looked away. His eyes were wet. Daniel noticed. You okay? Henry nodded. Just tired. Daniel reached for his hand. They sat there quietly. Then Henry said something Daniel had never expected. I was afraid you wouldn't come back. Daniel squeezed his hand. I was afraid you'd be gone when I did. Henry looked at him. I almost was. I know. Henry stared at the farmhouse. I used to sit on that porch every winter. Daniel smiled. Waiting? Henry nodded. For what? Henry looked at him. For that little boy to keep his promise. Daniel's eyes filled. I kept it. Henry smiled. You did. That evening, they returned to the house. Henry walked slowly into the workshop. He opened an old wooden cabinet. Inside were dozens of small things. Margaret's recipe cards, old photographs, a pocket watch, and the original photograph of Henry and Daniel. Henry took it out. Then he handed it to Daniel. You should have this. Daniel shook his head. No. Why? Because it belongs here. Henry smiled. It's yours. Daniel looked at the photograph. The 12-year-old boy stood beside Henry. Both were smiling. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I don't recognize him. Henry laughed softly. I do. Daniel looked up. What do you mean? I recognize the boy. Henry touched the photograph. He was scared. Daniel nodded. He was hungry. Daniel nodded again. He thought nobody wanted him. Daniel's eyes closed. Henry continued. But I knew something he didn't. What? Henry smiled. He was worth loving. Daniel couldn't hold back his tears. He leaned forward and hugged the old man. Henry held him. And for a long time, neither spoke. 3 months later, Henry's health began to decline. It happened quietly. He slept more. He walked less. But he remained happy. Daniel moved some of his work closer to Mill Creek so he could spend more time at the farmhouse. They ate dinner together. They worked in the workshop. They listened to the radio. And every evening, Daniel turned on the porch light. One night, Henry sat in his old chair. Daniel brought him a blanket. Henry smiled. You know, you don't have to keep coming back every night. Daniel sat beside him. I know. Your company needs you. They'll survive. Henry smiled. You've become stubborn. I learned from you. Henry laughed. Then his expression softened. Daniel? Yes? Do you remember what I told you about the compass? Daniel took it from his pocket. That it would help me find my way home. Henry nodded. You were right. Henry looked at the old compass, then at Daniel. No. Daniel frowned. What? Henry smiled. You were home the night you walked through that door. Daniel's eyes filled. Henry reached for his hand. I just didn't know it yet. Daniel lowered his head. Ears fell onto their joined hands. Henry squeezed his fingers. Thank you. Daniel shook his head. No. Henry smiled. Yes. For what? For coming back. Daniel looked at him. I owed you. Henry slowly shook his head. No, son. Daniel froze. Henry had never called him that, not once. Henry's voice became barely a whisper. You never owed me anything. Daniel's tears came harder. But I wanted to. Henry smiled. I know. He leaned back in the chair. The porch light glowed beside them, warm, quiet, steady. The same light that had waited 20 years. Henry passed away 6 weeks later, peacefully, in his own bedroom. In the house he had fought so hard to keep, Daniel was beside him. He held Henry's hand until the very end. Afterward, Daniel stayed in the farmhouse alone. The silence felt different now, not empty, just still. He walked through the kitchen. Henry's blue mug was still above the sink. The old wooden chair was still in the workshop. The photograph was still on the shelf. And the compass was still in Daniel's hand. He walked outside. The sun was setting over Mill Creek. Daniel stood on the porch. He turned on the light. Then he looked toward the road. For a moment he imagined himself 12 again, cold, hungry, afraid, knocking 3 times. He closed his eyes and heard Henry's voice in his memory. Come in. Daniel smiled through his tears. Then he whispered, You gave me a place to belong when I had nowhere to go. He looked back at the farmhouse. I spent 20 years trying to repay you. A tear rolled down his cheek. but now I understand. He placed the old compass on the porch railing. I never owed you a debt. Daniel looked toward the empty chair inside. You gave me a home. He took one last breath. And I'll leave the light on. The camera of memory would linger there, an old farmhouse, an empty chair, a wooden compass resting beneath the porch light, and a man standing alone, finally understanding that sometimes the greatest gift one human being can give another isn't money, it isn't success, it isn't even a lifetime. Sometimes, it's simply opening the door when someone has nowhere else to go. And because Henry Whitaker opened that door one freezing night in 1988, a frightened little boy found a home. And 20 years later, that boy came back to make sure the man who gave it to him never lost his. Some stories end with answers. The ones that matter most begin with understanding. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more untold stories. Until our next untold story, take care.